and the subject is one that affects all complex trauma survivors. And this is the subject of guilt. Now, guilt in itself is not a bad thing, right? Our guilt is really of benefit to us, and it helps us to, dare I say, be a good person. Because imagine if you didn't have guilt. You see, your guilt is what separates you from being a psychopath or a sociopath or a narcissist. So you should view your guilt as a gift. But many trauma survivors instead view it as a bane. They say, I'm afraid I'm going to feel guilty. Where this comes up a lot is when it comes time to cut off toxic family members, especially cutting off the mom who is a toxic family member. Many survivors say, I would cut off my mom. I know I should cut off my mom, but I can't because I would feel so guilty. Or what if something happened? Or what if something went wrong? And so if we're struggling with guilt getting in the way of us doing something that would be to our benefit, how can we manage that guilt? How can we overcome it? Do we need to recalibrate the guilt? Because guilt is, as I said, a good thing. You see, if we don't have it, then that would make us a bad person. That would make us capable of doing unspeakable evil. So it's adaptive. It's good that we have the guilt, and guilt will define as a pain that you feel when you do something that you believe is wrong. So it's kind of like an internal punishment system, right? It's good that people have an internal punishment system, don't you think? It adds a lot more order to the universe, and it helps to kind of keep people in line, ourselves included, right? So again, we need to see this as a gift. But should guilt control us? Should guilt control us? What do you think? Well, when it comes to our fear, if you remember our discussion on conquering fear, we were helped to appreciate that our fear is kind of like a bodyguard. Do you remember that? And so what's a way that we could view our guilt, kind of using the same concept or the same illustration? What's a way that we could view our guilt? Well, let me share an example with you here. You see this picture? This little guy here, he's our accountant, right? So illustratively, you could view guilt like your accountant. You see, your accountant works for you, just as your guilt should be working for you. It is not the boss. It is not the master. It is not the CEO. It is not the king. It is not in charge. You are in charge. You're the boss, but the accountant works for you, and you contract your accountant to do what? To care for the values in your bank account and to let you know if you're going over or if there's a problem, right? So the same thing with our inner accountant, our guilt. It manages the values, our value system inside the subconscious. The values are synonymous with the self. And so our accountant manages those values, or our guilt is managing our inner values and letting us know when we violated one of those inner values. Because if we've done that, we've violated ourselves. It's letting us know if we've compromised something we believe in. And so it can be very important. It can be very useful, but what it is not is in charge. It works for us. And so what would you do if your accountant said, sir or ma'am, I have to tell you, I have to warn you, you've been spending a little bit too much? What would you do? Would you say, I can't handle myself. I'm not capable of controlling my spending. I give up. I surrender all control to you, the accountant. Well, that would be extreme, right? Likewise, you wouldn't go to the other extreme, as some people sear their guilt. They sear their own conscience, right? So they don't feel the guilt because they can't handle the pain. And so you wouldn't just fire your accountant for letting you know that there's a problem. So what's the proper way to respond when your accountant lets you know, hey, you're overdoing it? What's the proper way to respond? It's just to thank him, right? And say, oh, wow, thank you. You're right. Let me make the necessary adjustments. And that's where it comes back to you. You being the leader, you being the boss, you being the one who is in control. With your power comes a responsibility. And your responsibility is to do what is right, to live according to your morals, your principles. This is a part of being ethical. So we cannot be the higher self if we're constantly going around compromising our principles, and we'll constantly be compromising our principles if we don't have guilt. So guilt, as an expression of the conscious, which is the subconscious mind, is an asset to us. It's our little accountant. It maintains our values. It lets us know when we're going over. It lets us know if we're in danger of going over or if we've made a violation. But we shouldn't be angry at the accountant and fire it. That is to sear the conscience. And we shouldn't be overreactive and fear the accountant as if it's the boss. We should simply thank it because it's doing its job. Does that make sense? So we have to be able to recognize that we have the ability to manage our guilt. So imagine some situations where you may feel guilty or may have felt guilty in the past, right? So your friend says, hey, why don't you leave the party with me? And you say, no, I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay. And I say, come on. You say, no, I'm going to stay. And then they leave, but they get in an accident. And then you feel how? Perhaps if you're a guilt-driven person, you feel guilty. And you think, boy, if I would have been with them, maybe this wouldn't have happened. So you feel guilty that your friend got into an accident. You feel responsible. Or in the situation of having to cut off a toxic family member, we may be struggling with the feeling that we will feel guilty if we lose contact with them and then they end up in the hospital or they die and we weren't on good terms with them or we weren't communicating with them. And we fear that we would feel guilty. Or you may have been raised a certain way, like your house is to always be clean. And then, so if you go to bed without cleaning your whole house, you feel guilty. Or you may have guilt around success. Like if you do well or you're successful, you actually feel bad about it. And you feel guilty that you're doing well, or guilty that you're successful because of where you came from. And there's so many people who are struggling. And so you actually feel bad for doing good. Or there's people who are making you feel bad for what you have or what you've done, or for cutting off a family member. So if these situations are similar to your own, where you start to feel like this guilt is controlling your life, we need to solve this. And we solve the problem of guilt controlling us by understanding what guilt really is and why it's out of order. Because in these scenarios, having guilt about these things could really be out of order, or in other words, disordered guilt. You see, because when it doesn't work for our advantage to the current situation we're in, then it's not adaptive. So then that would be maladaptive guilt. And many trauma survivors are experiencing maladaptive guilt. Why? Because of the way they were raised. right? Sadie says, when I was born in my family, it was like they said to me, Sadie, it is your job to make us feel better by being our emotional, verbal, and physical punching bag. She says, I agreed to this and did my job well. And then as I got older, I continued to do the job of making others feel well at my own expense. Well, I don't want to do this job anymore, she says. Guilt has kept me trapped. If you grew up in a toxic family environment, guilt may have been weaponized against you to try to keep you in line, keep you in place. It was a mechanism of control. It may have been to avoid guilt. You would put up with abuse, or you would be controlled, or you would be pleasing, or you would be high achieving, just to be able to avoid having to feel the guilt, because in your family, you weren't just allowed to feel guilty for a short period of time and then made to feel better, made to feel regulated again. In a toxic family environment, a narcissistic parent or an abusive parent may have kept you feeling guilty and wanted to keep you feeling guilty so that you would be more controllable. You may have been raised to feel guilty for things that were not your fault and were out of your control. If your brother hurt himself, you're to blame. If your parents get in an argument, it's your fault. We don't have enough money ever since you came along, because you're taking up too much of the, so you're a child feeling like you're taking up too much of the family's money. You see how being raised in this environment conditions you to have a maladaptive guilt, a faulty conscience that's condemning you even beyond what you should adaptively be condemned for. Again, it can be a good thing if we do have guilt for legitimately doing something wrong. Keeps us in line, makes us a good person. But we need to understand that we are in control and we are the masters of our emotions. We decide if we feel guilt or not. So when you're in a healed state, and this may sound strange, but when you are in a healed state, you only feel guilty when you want to feel guilty. Yes. There is no guilt that you don't want. It's maladaptive. The guilt that you feel when you are a healed person is guilt you want to feel because you have legitimately violated your personal values, your morals, your standards, and you want the inner punishment system at that moment. And you say, I feel bad because what I did was wrong, but I'm happy I feel this because what I did was wrong, or it wasn't good enough, or I didn't do enough. There is an adaptive way to feel guilt, but if guilt is actually preventing you from healing, i.e., I can't cut off my family member because I would feel guilty, that's maladaptive, that's disordered. So we need to manage it. That means to bring it into order, to bring the guilt into alignment with the self. The self is the values, and the values is an important part of understanding how to manage guilt, because all of your guilt can be managed by understanding where emotions actually come from. And so if you're taking notes, please take down that our emotions come from our perception of how reality interacts with our values. That's where emotions come from, our perception of how reality interacts with our values. So where does guilt come from? It's the same thing. It's your perception of how reality is interacting with your values, i.e., the idea that in reality, you believe you are responsible or to blame for violating what you believe is right. That is where guilt comes from. To make it more simple, the thoughts. What's going on up here is where the feelings come from. If we change the thoughts, we will change the feelings. The stories we are telling ourselves is where the guilt comes from. If you change the story you're telling yourself, you will be able to manage the guilt. You will be able to mitigate, that is to minimize the guilt. In other words, you don't have to fear guilt. You don't have to say, I'm afraid to do something that's good for me because I would feel guilty to do it. That doesn't make sense. So make it make sense by bringing the guilt in order and recognizing that you can manage your emotions. You can manage your guilt. It is your responsibility, in fact, to manage the guilt. So how do we do it? Well, in that definition, you might have recognized there were three main components to the emotions or to the guilt. Did you catch those? Those three components. Look at that definition as you have it written down. What are the three components to the guilt? Reality, values, and perception. Those are the three components. This is a tool that I speak about in my book, Mind. I show you in the chapter about emotions how to use this tool that I call the control panel of the emotions to manage any unpleasant, undesirable emotional states. Maladaptive guilt is one of those states that needs to be managed. The situations that I named are not situations where we need to be racked or controlled by guilt. So how do we manage our guilt? How do we manage the guilt using the control panel of emotions? Well, if you look here on this illustration, what we have is three panel doors, right? Kind of like what an electrician would have if he has to go in and actually work on the wiring for a system. Well, our system also has these three doors, this control panel. So we can go in one of these three doors always, at least one of them. We can alter what's behind that door and change our emotional state instantaneously. It will have an instantaneous effect. That means that you can alleviate your guilt like that. You have to know how to do it. Here's how. Reality, values, perception. Which door are we going to go into? So let's take an example. For instance, what we were talking about. You leave your friend and something happens to your friend. Now they're in the hospital. Can you change that? Can you change the reality of them being in the hospital? No. So we need to leave that door alone because we can't get access to that right now. Values. Can we change our inner values? Well, let's take a look. What is the value that's being violated in this case? Well, the value that's being violated in this case is that we value our friend, we value his safety or her safety, and now they've been hurt. Can we alter that? Well, we could. We could say, I don't care if my friend gets hurt. But probably we wouldn't want to do that. Why? Because it's too intrinsic to who we are at the core. So we won't alter the values. We'll leave that alone, shut that door, and then we go into the perception of the situation. The beautiful thing about the door of perception is that you can always alter the perception. So how do we alter our perception around feeling guilty that our friend got hurt when we didn't go home with them after the party? Well, you just analyze. What is my perception of this? Well, my perception of the situation is that I'm responsible for what happened because I could have been there. And then change the perception. Well, could I have predicted the future? No. So therefore, my perception is based on a cognitive distortion, which is that I'm supposed to be able to predict the future. There's no way I could have known that would have happened. It was random. Did I cause the car accident? No. Okay, so therefore I am not at fault. Let me flip the perception from I am at fault for what happened to I am not at fault for what happened. And it's sad what happened to them. It still violates my values, what happened. But you see, now I'm no longer blaming myself. I am not at fault for what happened. There's no way I could predict the future. There's no way I could predict that my friend would get in that car accident. And there's no way to guarantee that if I had gone with the friend, that all wouldn't have happened. Isn't that right? Everything I'm saying is true. I haven't told a lie about a thing, but I'm just telling the other side of the truth. You see, in reality, when you look at the truth in its full capacity, you realize that the perception I had was maladaptive. It was a distorted perception. It's called self-blame. You're blaming the self. And there is a list of cognitive distortions in my book. And so when you recognize that one of your perceptions is based on a cognitive distortion, then you realize that you need to change that distorted viewpoint to a real viewpoint. And the real viewpoint is, it's so sad what happened to my friend, but it is not my fault. I did not cause the car accident. I cannot guarantee if I were there, I could have made it better. It could have actually been worse. And now that I'm seeing it in this manner, what happens to my guilt? Diminished. It goes from 80 percentile to a cool 15% guilt, which I can live with. Because maybe it would have gone different, but there's no way to guarantee that. And there's no reason to focus on that because it's outside of the realm of what's in my control. This is making sense? So let's take another example of a situation that could make us feel guilty. So we're worried about cutting off our mom or cutting off our boyfriend or our girlfriend or our husband who is toxic. So what should we do? Just not do it because it's going to make us feel guilty? Well, as soon as we see that our guilt is preventing us from doing something that's good, that is propitious, that is of benefit to the self, then that means that we need to reorder the guilt. So we go into the control panel, we first look at the reality. So on the reality basis, is there anything I can do with the reality of cutting my mom off that will help me to alleviate the guilt? Well, in some cases, I can mitigate that guilt by making sure that I don't end my communication with my mom in a way that's harsh or mean, like having a big fight and storming out or saying something rude and mean. I don't need to do all that. I may just choose to quietly step back and just disengage. And so that will help to mitigate the guilt because I won't be creating a big scene or further insult to whatever potential injury that I'm fearing my mother could feel. Let's take a look at the values. So the inner values is that my mother drilled into my head for my whole life that you never, ever stop talking to family, and family is everything. And I am your mom. And so I am the exception to every rule. And you are supposed to take care of me. You were born to take care of me. And so I've got all these rules in my head, these ideas in my head, and these are values that came from where? Oh, wow, these values are faulty values. They came from the very person who I need to cut off. Wow, so are some of these values a little skewed? Is family actually everything? That's a little bit extreme, isn't it? My number one responsibility in this universe is to care for myself so that I can do good for others. I can't do good for others if I'm dying inside. And right now, my family is killing me because they're toxic. So family is everything does not apply to toxic, abusive family. Ooh, wow, shift my value there. I got to shift my value. My mom is my mom, so that means that she's exempt from all the rules. And she can be as abusive and as awful as she wants to be, and she's not accountable. Is that a healthy value? And nope. When I think about it in my logical mind, I realize my mom is a human being. She's not a god. I'm not here to worship her. And whereas I would love to love her, and I do love her, I do not need to tolerate abuse just because someone has the title of mom. So therefore, I have to apply the higher principle of protecting myself and protecting my spirituality and protecting my emotional well-being and protecting my mental health by cutting off, yes, even this person who has the special title, mom. Because at the end of the day, this imperfect human being is causing ruin and decimation, and I will not allow myself to be ruined. So I will put distance. I needed to alter my values. Right? And the list can go on to the values that we may need to alter when it comes to standing up to family members or cutting them off. If it's a boyfriend or a love interest that we need to cut off, we might have had values such as being in a relationship is everything. My worth and my value comes from a relationship. Or I am responsible for keeping them alive because they say they'll kill themselves if I leave them. But if I alter the value to I am not responsible for keeping everyone else alive, I'm responsible for keeping myself alive. Also, I cannot guarantee that someone is going to stay alive because I do what they tell me to do. So I value not being controlled and not being manipulated. I value taking care of myself, and he is supposed to take care of himself too. I value people taking care of themselves and not putting that type of responsibility and burden on other people. I value my freedom and other people's freedom, right? And you see how as we alter the values, the guilt starts to diminish. Can you sense that? And then what about the perceptions? Closely related to the values is the way we're looking at it. A perception is a perspective. So then we realize, oh, instead of looking at this as I'm a bad child if I cut my mom off, we can change the perception to I am bringing honor to my parents by taking care of myself. Because if in the end I end up incapacitated because I didn't care for my mental health, that doesn't honor my parents. Now, does it? No. I can be a better human when I'm feeling better. I can be at my best when I'm feeling at my best. I can be more good when I feel good. So let me manage my feelings. Let me protect my emotional self. And let me pull back on these toxic relationships. Is it making sense? So there, as we've managed the perception, now we've been able to alter the emotional state and mitigate the guilt. All of a sudden, I don't feel so guilty about those things anymore. Do you see how you have the ability to be the master over your emotional state? You have the ability to go in and decide for yourself if you're going to feel guilty about something. You're not required to feel guilty about anything. You see, because if something doesn't violate your values, then you won't feel guilt over it. So you may have to alter the values. But in all cases, you can alter the perception of the situation. And so let's take another example. Let's say you feel guilty because you're going to bed without making sure your entire house is clean. Because your mom always said, or your grandma always said, your house has to be clean. Okay. Can we alter is there something in the reality we can change so as not to feel guilty about this situation? Well, the whole discussion is over whether or not we're viewing a not clean house as being something we have to feel guilty for. So this is all about values and perception again. So we look at that value. Your house has to always be clean. It's an extreme value, isn't it? Yeah. So maybe we can alter that to make it more sophisticated, make it more accurate. What would be a more accurate, sophisticated value instead of my house has to always be clean? How about my house should generally be clean? How about my house should be reasonably clean when possible? But I value my rest over the looks of my home, over the aesthetics of the home. I value my physical health over that. And bam, as we shift the values, what happens? Now we've shifted the emotional state. We're no longer feeling guilty if we do choose to go to bed without picking up all of the things or sweeping the floor or whatever. And then we change the perception of the situation. And the perception of the situation may have been, I'm a bad wife, or I don't take care of my house well if I allow a little bit of things to be left out. And we can change that perception to actually what makes me a good wife or a good housekeeper is that I'm laid back and I know how to care for me, the queen of this household, over trying to please everyone, including eyes that aren't even here, like my grandma's eyes. Making sense? Instead of, well, I feel guilty for being successful because all the people back in my old neighborhood, they didn't have as much, or we grew up poor, or I don't want anyone to think that I'm anything special. Well, hold on. I value my success and what's good for me above and beyond what other people are thinking of me. And if I really care about them, I can help them more when I am successful. So I'm going to go ahead and take my guilt, and I'm going to feel my guilt while I'm driving my Mercedes Benz or my Audi. I'm going to feel guilty in my Audi or in my penthouse apartment or whatever that little beacon of success is in your perception. You're taking the guilt with you and saying, okay, I'm going to manage it. Instead of 80% guilt, and I'm going to keep myself small so that I don't feel this guilt, I'm going to diminish that guilt to just a 15%. I'm going to be 80% purpose-driven instead of fear-driven. And I'm going to become everything I want to be. And then I can feel my little 15% of guilt when I'm in my dream car. And then I can start thinking about how I like to share what I have with others. So let us manage our perceptions. Just because things bad or something bad may happen, it doesn't mean it's my fault. There's a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration. So take the time to use the tools. How do you do it? Use the control panel of emotions. It's one of the tools you can use to manage your guilt. You can also use the JOT method. The JOT method works wonders on managing guilt. But it is not our most mature statement to say, I'm afraid that I'll feel guilty, so I'm not going to do something that's of benefit to me. Don't say that anymore. Don't fear guilt. Manage guilt. Be the boss. Be the king. Be the CEO. Be appreciative of your accountant. Listen to him. Take his advice. But don't let him run the show.